G'day folks, welcome to this review of The Dark Summer, Normandy 1944. This was designed by Ted Raicer and published by GMT Games in 2021. This is a regimental, brigade, almost divisional level scale representation of the Normandy campaign from the 6th of June through until about the end of the third week of August. So it covers the initial landings, the attempt to link these bridgeheads together, the capture of Cherbourg, the cutting off of the Cotentin Peninsula, the Cobra drive down the coast, the Falaise pocket. You have this map covers everything from an abstracted Cherbourg down to Avranches on the coast, all the way out to Alençon in the east, and up to the Orne River and beyond. It features Caen, the capture of Caen, everything in the middle here. Coutances, Bayeux, of course. Very broad, big scale representation, all on a single, roughly 22 by 34 inch map. So very accessible, easy to set up. The game revolves around a chit pull mechanism. Each turn, you will typically draw a counter out of the cup, which will activate units, either American, Commonwealth, or German forces for either movement or combat. When units are activated for movement, typically they move around. When they're activated for combat, typically they don't move, but they may engage in combat. The Allies also have the possibility of spending combined actions on these activations under certain conditions, which let them do a one hex movement and then combat with one shift to the left. So they can work around those limitations. The American activation counters, incidentally, are combat on one side, move on the other. So the Germans have the Americans have some flexibility. Germans are the same. British markers, however, are move or combat. And this is a clever design decision that Ted Raicer has made. So much of this is a masterpiece of game design for effect. This is, while so many features of the Normandy campaign are abstract, which I'll talk about in a moment, the flow of the game, the story it tells, the narrative that evolves tends to follow that historical path. And that is largely due to the victory point objectives that both sides are striving towards. Ted Raicer has designed this game, the map, the abstractions, and these victory point objectives such that players, in pursuing victory, are striving for historical outcomes. So, and many of the other rules complement this as well. So, for example, when the Americans cut the Cotentin Peninsula, any German units north of that cut-off line retreat to Cherbourg. So this drives the historical American pursuit across the peninsula. If the Americans fail to capture Cherbourg by turn 7, the Germans automatically win. And the Germans start to accumulate victory points the longer this takes. And the Americans, if they can capture it very quickly, will gain a lot of victory points. So they are also rushing to capture Cherbourg and secure the port as quickly as possible. And thus they're driven towards these historical outcomes. The Brittany box, way down the south here, past Avranches, also secures the Americans' victory points, and so they have this historical, once they've cut off the peninsula, once they've secured Cherbourg, this drive down the coast towards Avranches, towards Brittany, to pursue those victory points, which drives them towards those historical objectives. And the same thing is happening out in the east with the capture of Caen and the securing of what's called the eastern exit box way up in the northeast. All these elements of the game, the victory points, and the way this all unfolds, pushes the players towards these historical objectives in a very subtle way, not to quite say you have to do this, but well, if you want to stand a chance of winning the game, this is what you do. You kind of got to pursue history. You can't. There are various ways you can do this. You could capture Cherbourg and then try and drive through the centre to shift around towards Brittany, or surround Caen. There's many different ways you can approach the securing of these objectives, but you are driving for those objectives nonetheless. So, as I said, one map covering about 2.25 miles per hex, but many elements are abstracted. So Cherbourg doesn't appear on the map. The Cotentin Peninsula is cut off in half, and there's basically a few exit hexes. You leave the map to go and lay siege to Cherbourg if you're German to protect Cherbourg. And then combat in Cherbourg is abstracted via the Cherbourg combat table. Once per combat activation chip, you can activate the combat in Cherbourg if you have at least 1-to-1 odds. And you hope to eliminate, the Allies at least are hoping to eliminate the German defenders. What else? The Brittany box is also abstracted. The Americans send units into Brittany, into this box. Once they're in Brittany, they can remain there to secure long-term victory points, or they can swing around and re-enter sort of south of Falaise, and thus, in effect, recreate the Falaise pocket and the fighting and the German withdrawal. The Germans have their own objectives. They're trying to inflict damage on the Allies. They're trying to hurt the Rangers and airborne units, paratroopers and gliders and the like. They're trying to delay the Allied advance, trying to delay the capture of Cherbourg for as long as possible. Where feasible, they also want to withdraw some units to the northeast to protect, I guess, that expansion of the Allies up in the northeast. So yeah, these victory conditions drive the narrative of the game, the story of the game, and what the players are doing. I mentioned it is chip draw mechanics. What I love about this game is you've got a lot of decision making to make on this broad scale, but the implementation on a smaller scale is really quite simple and direct. Movement is pretty straightforward. Moving along roads, primary roads. There's quite a few different terrain types. It can get a bit tricky because there are different costs for Allied and German movements. So, for example, woods costs the Allies 2 to move through, but only 1 for the Germans. Forests, 3 for the Allies, 2 for the Germans. My first game, it was a bit tricky getting my head around that and just remembering the different movement costs. While my second game, I'm pretty sure I had it all 100% complete, probably a mistake here or there. There are support assets, such as tactical air and tank destroyers, and the Germans have their Nebelwerfer and artillery, and these can be brought into combat. Combat is a beautifully simple process. I personally love simple, streamlined combat systems. I've just played through Atlantic War, and combat there was a headache to work through the different steps and armor superiority. Here, it's just work out attacker strength, defender strength. You can add assets if you want, which add to that strength. Sometimes there are column shifts for terrain, and then you roll a d6 and consult the lovely combat results table for a series of very clear combat results. So if you like simple combat, that's great. One thing confusing this sometimes is the series of special rules for bocage and city hexes. For bocage, and again, the first playthrough, I made a few mistakes here. Basically, in bocage, German defenders can ignore DR, and when they have 2 or more steps, treat DR asterisk results as BL1. For bocage, that only applies for turns 1 to 6. For cities, throughout turns 1 to 10. So that's a little bit of a tricky concept to get your head around as well. It's not too tricky, but it's just something to be mindful of. And this is Normandy, and there is bocage everywhere. So the Germans on the defence, they're always active. Unlike some other Normandy games where the Germans are just plugging the lines, they're always making critical decisions here. So the defending player, the German player, is always active. They're always watching. They can always, I mentioned it's a chip draw, but the German player each turn will get a number of these reaction counters, and they can play these after an Allied activation counter to respond with a formation, a division, or with a stack of units. And these reactions are critical in preventing Allied breakthrough, in shifting German forces around to block the line and to contain the Allies as much as possible on the northern area of Normandy. What counters are active in a turn, what counters are available, what counters go into a cup on a turn is driven by another beautiful mechanic, which is the weather mechanic in this game. The weather mechanics are another driving force of this narrative. I mentioned the victory points drive the story. Weather, too, drives what happens on a turn. There are 9 weather counters in the game. There is 1 storm. I believe there is 1 rain. And then there are a few showers. There may be 2 rain actually, but a couple of showers, sunny turns, cloudy turns. They all go into a cup. Each turn you draw one of these out, and that's the weather for the turn. The weather determines what activation counters go in the cup. So it's this sort of dark brown colour for rain or storm. It benefits the Germans. So the Germans get more reactions. The Allies get fewer activations, fewer move, fewer combats, and various other little subtle rules, weather rules, benefit the Germans. The Germans can use their artillery. They can move through clear terrain more freely because Allied air is grounded. Beautiful ways to reflect the thematic history. On stormy turns, there's no Allied air coverage, and so the Germans can move more freely. On sunny and cloudy turns, with heavy Allied air superiority and coverage of roads, Germans are heavily restricted in their movement. They can no longer use the cheaper road costs to move around more rapidly. It's much more dangerous. So the sunny and cloudy turns, even a little bit of overcast, the Allied air can get through. They benefit the Allies. Now, every time one of these counters, the weather counter, is drawn from the cup, you place it on the turn track and it's done. It doesn't go back into the cup. So you know that throughout the course of the campaign, the weather is always going to balance out. In the first game I played, I had shower. The first one is always showers, and then I drew showers, I think rain, and then more showers perhaps. And then I had a string of sunny and cloudy turns towards the end of the campaign. In this second playthrough, I had showers, but then I had cloudy and sunny quite early on, and they were critical because these Allied breakthroughs happened on those cloudy and sunny turns with Allied air support, and the Germans couldn't move rapidly enough with their prohibitive movement costs to plug these gaps. So the weather is really critical, and the Germans need to be very mindful of that and be in a position to respond to Allied advances. So yes, the weather drives the chips that are placed in the cup. On a sunny turn, the Allies can expect to do a lot. The Germans won't be able to react much. On a rainy or stormy turn, the Germans will be able to do a lot, and the Allies not so much. So there's you feel like the initiative almost shifts back and forth. On a cloudy turn, it's cloudy and sunny. The Allies are optimistic. On a rainy or stormy turn, the Germans are thinking we can react to whatever they do, and they won't be able to do much. There is certainly a lot of historical flavour here. If you want to stand a chance of winning the game, you kind of need to pursue those historical objectives. And that's not to say you can't. I mean, you could potentially, as the Allied player, bring all your forces into drive through Bayeux towards Falaise straight away, but you're not going to capture Cherbourg, and you're going to instantly lose the game. The same, I guess, with Caen. The British can ignore Caen and just move out to the west and come through Bayeux. But if they don't capture Caen, they lose those victory points. So, yeah, I guess both players are thinking about, to win the game, they need victory points, and to gain those victory points, they kind of need to stick roughly to historical objectives. How they achieve those objectives is open, and as I said, there's a lot of flexibility in the movement of formations, of where these divisions go, where they land, where they head, where you concentrate your strength. Decisions such as, do I drive on Cherbourg straight away? You could land the 4th Division and dedicate the 101st Airborne and 82nd Airborne straight away to move towards Cherbourg and try to capture Cherbourg potentially on the 1st or 2nd or 3rd turn without cutting the peninsula. Or you could cut the peninsula. Or you could wait and let reinforcements focus on Cherbourg and move those 101st, 82nd, 4th Division to the south to try and secure some key terrain towards Coutances. There's a lot of options here. You could not worry so much about the Cotentin Peninsula and focus more on attacks towards Saint-Lô and driving through that bocage early before more reinforcements arrive. There's a lot of these broad strategic decisions you could make. You can't just ignore Cherbourg. You can't just ignore Caen, but how you go about that and the timing of that, these are the kind of juicy decisions that you're making. And again, it is all quite broadly abstracted. In terms of timescale, as I've mentioned, each turn in the game, roughly 8 to 15 activations, reflects roughly 1 week of the campaign. So we start, for example, with the June 2, the second week in June, from 6th to the 13th of June. Then we go June 3 and June 4. Then we start with the first week in July and so forth. So there's roughly 10 weeks of this campaign. And the 8 to 15 activations that make up a complete turn represent roughly 1 week of campaigning. So if you kind of take a step back every now and then and reflect on what week you're at and what's happening, so often it is close to schedule and you're doing things that happened historically, often just either faster than historical timing or a little bit behind historical timing. Even the first game that I played where the Allies weren't aggressive enough, we kind of eventually drove through Coutances just weeks behind historical schedule. In this second game, we followed the same sort of pattern of advance, but we were ahead of schedule. In terms of how to approach this game, there are some important tactical and strategic considerations that both players need to keep in mind. The Allies need to attack aggressively. I think the best Allied strategy is to attack. The combat results table isn't too punitive to the attacker. The very worst outcome, if you can at least secure 1 to 3 odds, that's 1 attacker to 3 defenders. The worst outcome is 1 attacker step loss. If you're less than this, if you can't achieve 1 to 3, there's an automatic AL2 result, which you don't want to happen. But if you can at least secure that, the worst that can happen is a 1 to 3. And even at 2 to 1, you can force an exchange result, which eliminates the defender. At 3 to 1, there's a chance you'll eliminate the entire defensive stack. And at 6 to 1 odds, you have a 2 in 3 chance of wiping out the entire defensive stack. So the Allies really want to be on the offensive. They want to attack as much as possible. It's difficult through bocage, so they want to look for beneficial terrain to attack into. Basically anything but a bocage and a city hex is good terrain to attack into. Even marsh hexes are nice. They only create 1 column shift to the left. Conversely, on the German side, they want to defend in bocage. Bocage is beautiful for the Germans. They ignore DR results. They treat DR asterisk, kind of an extra type of retreat, into step losses instead and hold their ground. So the Germans are often willingly giving up just a little bit of ground to defend in these key bocage terrain hexes. The question then becomes how much ground and when do they give up this ground? They can't give up too much ground because then they're giving up the entire map. So it creates, again, these really interesting and agonizing decisions for the German player. When do they use their reaction chit? When do they respond to these Allied movements? When the German activation marker comes out, do they spend a move to rush reinforcements to the front? Or do they play combat and just wait? Keeping in mind, another rule that I haven't mentioned is they can only play 2 moves per turn. They can't move. So one of those has to be a combat. And if their first 2 activations are moves, their third chit has to be a combat. And if it's coming late in the turn, they may want to save that move for a reaction. So my advice again for new German players is, where feasible, save your second move activation for your last counter to be drawn so that you can respond. This is important because typically, on every turn but the first, the Allies will select one of their activations for the initiative. The Allies always have the initiative. They will always select one of the activations in a cup to play first. This means that if they've punched a hole in the German lines at the end of the previous turn, they can select a movement activation as their initiative activation to start the next turn and drive through that gap. And that's exactly what happened several times in this playthrough. So yes, keeping pressure on the Germans as the Allies, and the Germans stepping away from that pressure often. Because move and combat activations are on separate counters, you sort of activate the Americans for movement and they move up adjacent to the Germans, and they have to wait for the combat chit to come out before they can attack. This means that often what's happening is in between, you'll have this pattern. The Americans will move up next to the Germans, and the Germans will either react to simply walk away, or they'll draw a move counter to simply walk away. And then the American combat counter comes out, and there are no Germans adjacent to them to attack. Again, I mentioned that there are combined actions which can help the Allies to kind of mitigate that to some extent. So yes, that's kind of some ideas for broader strategy. The Allies need to be aggressive and attack. The Germans need to tread carefully, avoid those combats, try and conserve their forces as much as possible. That didn't happen in the second game. The I mentioned the wonderful, relatively straightforward CRT, a lot of German retreat results. Again, they can ignore those in Bocage. There are special weather effects on so many aspects of the game, on movement, on combat, on the type of counters you can use. So naval support is available on sunny, cloudy and shower turns for the allied player, but not during rain or storm. There's the Cherbourg combat table, which I mentioned, terrain effects chart. These are very clear player aid cards. We've got the action sheet availability, which I mentioned. There are replacements which play a relatively minor role in the game. Let me now bring you to my kind of final thoughts on this. I love this. This is a beautifully playable, broad, big-scale Normandy campaign game. It is most closely resembles Normandy 44 by Mark Simonich, and people have been asking me, how does it compare? I like this better as a game. I'm mindful, of course, again, of the slight difference in scale, but this creates what I've described as tastier decisions for both players. This is certainly a bigger scale, and there are those abstractions of Cherbourg, Brittany and so forth, but with, I guess, simpler movement. Some of the rules are simpler movement, simpler combat, without losing any of the kind of historical feel. So a simpler presentation, simpler rules, but still retaining a lot of that historical flavour. With high replayability. As I said, I finished one campaign, immediately set up another, and more to come. There are some quibbles. I should also point out that this is the third title in Ted Raicer's sort of Dark series. He created the Dark Valley, and then Dark Sands, and now Dark Summer. So it's using a similar system. And I will say that I have not played either of those two previous titles. The armour in this game seems, I guess, a missed opportunity. They're barely distinguishable from infantry in terms of the effects they have. And I can summarise them quite quickly in sort of 2 sentences. Firstly, armour receives slightly more replacements than infantry. So you generally want to take armour losses in combat for that reason, because you know you can replace them before you can replace your infantry generally. So armour can be replaced more frequently. The second point of difference is when faced against German flak, armour is at a disadvantage because flak is counted at full strength. If flak is facing infantry, it has a defense of 1. If flak is facing armour, it counts its full defense strength of, in this case, 4. So the interesting thing about armour is that it's often more vulnerable and weaker in combat compared to infantry, which seems, ahistorical in a sense. Yes, they get more replacements, but they're more vulnerable in combat. They generally, as well, as you'll see in this sort of counter here, they generally tend to have similar, if not the same, movement speeds. There are some armoured divisions, like the American 4th Armoured, which do have movement speeds of 12, and I don't think there are many infantry, if any infantry, that have that rapid rate of movement, but they are not too common. Most of the British armour certainly have movement speeds of 10. I'm just looking around and I can't see any British forces with a movement speed of 12. So it's just, I think, that American armour that has the fast movement speed. Other than that, armour, when you're moving these forces around, you wouldn't really distinguish much between armour and infantry. You want to make sure your armour isn't being sent into attack flak, and you want to make sure your armour is taking often the first step loss in combat so they can be replaced, but that's pretty much it for that distinction. The second little quibble is the relative weaknesses of towns. Towns like Carentan, for example, critical junction, very easily captured by the Allies. And again, we're thinking about the scale of this abstraction. We're talking about a week for these activations, so yeah, it's likely it would have been taken as it was historically. But so often, the Germans are opting to leave towns alone, not defend in there, and defend in adjacent bocage instead. They get far superior defensive benefits from Bocage than they do from Towns. Towns basically provide 1 column shift to the left. Bocage provides 2 column shift. They cancel retreats. They treat DR asterisk as a BL much better, such that the allies often don't want to attack into Bocage. They're looking for other hexes to attack into. Okay, so to wrap this all up, folks, this is a wonderful addition to our Normandy games. Keep in mind the broad brigade, regimental, divisional scale of units. The map hex scale, roughly 2.25 miles per hex. The abstraction of Cherbourg and Brittany and the East, and the time scale as well. Basically, a week to a turn, and a turn can consist of 10 to 15 activations, and there are 10 turns running over basically 10 weeks of the campaign. Keeping all that in mind, I highly recommend this. I would say if you're looking for just one game on the Normandy campaign, that is not a monster game. If you want the detail, look, something like Atlantic War by Decision Games or The Battle for Normandy by GMT. But as far as one mapper goes, you could sit down and potentially play this. Experienced players could play this in a single evening over a couple of hours. My first game took roughly 4 to 5 hours. My second game took about 3 hours, but it finished early with a decisive American victory. Very easy to play solo with a great story evolving. I haven't played it 2-player, but having played both sides, both players are making juicy, engaged decisions. They are both constantly engaged. The German player, despite being on the defensive and forming relatively static lines, is always active and always thinking about what decisions to make and always considering when they should react and how, and they always need to be mindful of potential allied breakthroughs and so forth. So always engaged. You are not just a passive player watching what the allies do, which is the case in some other games. As I said, the rules are relatively straightforward. The production quality is typical outstanding GMT games. Beautiful, thick, colourful, clear counters, great player aids. There's a playbook with a full example of play. I recommend when you get the game, read through that just to get a sense of how the game develops. You only need to read through the first couple of pages. You don't necessarily read through the whole thing, just to get a sense of how combat works and movement and some of those sort of nuances and exceptions. Yeah, look, I highly recommend this. If I could only keep one Normandy campaign, it would be The Dark Summer Normandy 1944. So folks, hopefully I've conveyed a sense of what this is like. It is very enjoyable, very historical, for sort of both sides. That is Ted Raicer's The Dark Summer, published by GMT Games in 2021. Thanks, everyone.